U.S. President Joe Biden has opened NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington with a pledge of more air defense systems for Ukraine. He's offering Kyiv an additional Patriot system and says allies will provide dozens more anti-missile batteries. This as Biden seeks to reassure allies at home and abroad that he's up for the job as president. Doubts about his fitness for office continue to plague his re-election campaign. Biden's offer to boost Kyiv's defenses came a day after the deadliest spate of airstrikes on Ukraine in months.
A major celebration. But the mood appears more tense than festive. The 75th anniversary comes during one of the most challenging times for NATO, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. For more than 2 years, the alliance has been tested for its unity in continuous support of Kyiv.
The United States and nearly 24 allied partners have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, and more countries will follow. Today, I'm announcing the historic donation of air defense equipment for Ukraine. The United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and Italy will provide Ukraine with the equipment for 5 additional strategic air defense systems. And in the coming months, the United States and our partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens of additional tactical air defense systems. The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line.
The decision could bring some long-awaited relief for Ukraine amid intensified Russian attacks. But it's not just a boost for defense that Ukraine has been asking for.
Imagine how much we can achieve when all limitations are lifted. We can protect our cities from Russian guided bombs if American leadership makes a step forward and allows us to destroy Russian military aircraft on their bases. And we can significantly limit Russian actions in southern Ukraine and push the occupier out of there if American leadership assists us with the necessary deep strike capabilities against Russian military and logistics in our Ukrainian Crimea.
And Zelensky wants such decisions to be made fast, before the US elections this November, the result of which could put both US support for Ukraine and even NATO itself into question.
For more on this, we can talk now with Fabrice Pothier. He is CEO of the consultancy Rasmussen Global and a former Director of Policy Planning at NATO. Thanks for being with us. Fabrice, Ukraine can certainly use the extra air defense systems that NATO countries are offering, but what it really wants is permission from its partners to strike deeper into Russian territory. Is that not essential for Ukraine in order to repel the Russian invasion?
Exactly. I think this is the story of the NATO leaders, including President Biden, expecting the Ukrainians to fight a war against a nuclear power with one hand tied behind their back. And this is obviously encouraging news to hear what President Biden has announced, the delivery of new Patriot systems, more tactical air defense systems to come in the next few weeks or months. But this is really fundamentally playing defensive here. And it's just allowing Ukraine not to be defeated, but it's not helping Ukraine to win this war. And this is really the difference or the dissonance between the Ukrainians and those supporting Ukraine and the NATO leaders.
What is stopping Ukraine's backers from giving it what it needs, Fabrice, to properly defend itself? Is it the internal divisions among NATO countries or fear of provoking Russia?
I think it's the second point you made. Fundamentally, especially in Berlin and Washington, there's a great reluctance to contemplate possible escalation with Russia or vis-à-vis Russia. And sadly, I think there is almost more fear of a Russian defeat than of a Ukrainian defeat. So that's why until now we have seen this kind of very iterative way of managing the war by making important decisions, but every time 6 months too late or even 12 months too late compared to the last Russian escalation. And even though it has allowed the Ukrainians to hold their more or less their line until now, it has not been enough, as we have seen over the last few days with the terrible attack against the children's hospital. It's not enough to even contain Russia, let alone defeat Russia. And because fundamentally it's this fear of the possibility that if we were putting really our will and our resources and allowing Ukrainians to strike where they need, we could in fact inflict Russia a defeat on the Ukrainian soil. And this is sometimes and largely unacceptable for some leaders, especially in Washington and Berlin.
Now, as you know, you're a former director of policy planning at NATO. As you know, NATO declared in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia will join the alliance. Now, 16 years later, many say that was an empty, reckless promise. How do you see it?
I will not say reckless and I will not say empty, but it is indeed a promise that loses its credibility as time passes. And sadly, the reality is the following. There are no other arrangements than NATO that can guarantee Ukraine its long-term sovereignty. And the moment we are able to guarantee Ukraine's long-term sovereignty, this is game over for Vladimir Putin. Fundamentally, what Putin is after is not so much kilometer square of territory. It's not only that, it's to undermine forever Ukraine's sovereignty. And we have the tool, NATO, in our hands to actually respond to that. But there is the same reluctance as we were discussing earlier, especially coming from Berlin and Washington, to take the risk of NATO membership, which in fact is to take the risk of peace on Ukrainian terms. And this is where we're stuck now.
Now, NATO has grown quite a bit. It's a huge alliance. President Biden says it's the greatest defense alliance in history. But the U.S. is NATO's biggest contributor by far. Can we expect that same level of commitment, Fabrice, from the U.S. after November's presidential election, especially if the winner is Donald Trump?
Well, this is obviously speculation, both on who will be the winner of the presidential election, but also what will the winner do if it's Donald Trump. However, I think the reality is, and this goes over many, many years and many U.S. presidents, the Europeans have to show more value for U.S. money and commitment. And the numbers are better. I think we're talking about now 2/3 of the allies who are spending up to 2%. Which is a big contrast from a few years ago. However, I think the next frontier for the Europeans is to show that this money that they are spending on paper is translating on the ground with more capacity to defend Europe. Where we are still lagging behind and still very dependent on the US is we're talking a lot about European defense, but the reality is the Europeans cannot defend Europe. And I think it's important for the Europeans to come forward with the next occupant of the White House on the 6th of January with a clear plan about how Europe in the next 5-10 years will be able to build enough capabilities and capacity that it can do the majority of defending Europe, including with the Ukrainians. I think if we had a plan like this, there will be a more convincing and a more positive conversation.
What do you see as the main challenges that NATO will face in the coming years? And particularly, how concerned do you think NATO should be about growing military cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea?
It should be very deeply concerned about this metastasizing alliance of the autocracies. Which is a fact of the war and Russia's need to basically reach to its autocratic friends for more bombs and more munitions to kill more Ukrainian people. This is a very sad reality of this war. So we will have, the front is not just on the eastern border of NATO, but the front is now almost globalized. and we'll have to think globally. That doesn't mean NATO will have to be everywhere and everything, but it means it will have to have strategies to respond to possible threat that might not come necessarily from the East, but might come from different domains and different theaters. That's one thing. Second, I think this is all about what we do at home. And this is coming back to the other big challenge of NATO in the next few years. And the next Secretary General, Mark Rutte, will have to face that, is internal divisions and internal doubts. It's not just divisions, it's doubts within the NATO population about the need to spend more, the need to be on a pre-war footing. And I think that will be the big challenge.
Fabrice, thank you very much for your insights. That was Fabrice Pothier, CEO of Rasmussen Global. Thanks a lot. Let's talk to our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly. Nick, how is Ukraine responding to the signals coming from the NATO summit?
Look, Terry, I think the bigger problem here is that Ukraine hasn't heard a convincing story as to what is different this time around compared to last year's summit in Vilnius, where Ukraine didn't get a convincing roadmap to membership. It seems like the NATO countries are trying to look for some kind of new fudge, some kind of new kind of wording to explain that, yes, Ukraine will join and that's definitely going to happen, but when, don't ask us. That is a major problem seen from here, because this is not about this current phase of the war, right? No one in Ukraine expects NATO troops to turn up on the front lines in eastern Ukraine. But for the future, this is vital, because without security guarantees, there is a big question mark about whether the millions of Ukrainian refugees who are already in Europe will ever come back without having some kind of certainty that Russia can't invade again. And even for people here, once the borders are open, you might have millions of people still in the country because of those limitations on men leaving because they just don't think it's worth trying to build a future in a country that could potentially come under attack so soon again. So this is crucial from a Ukrainian perspective. In the 90s, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union in return for security guarantees that turned out to be pretty much worthless. So there is a real push here that this is a country that longer term will not agree to anything less than security guarantees. And I think there's the broader question of, do NATO members want to see Ukraine win, or is it just about stopping Ukraine losing? And that was what we heard Zelensky there asking for permission to use US weapons against Russian targets further away from the border, to really go after those airports, military airports and other targets. Right now, Ukraine is only allowed to hit targets about 100 kilometers from that border. And that decision on its own could make a huge difference and allow Ukraine to make it that much harder for Russia to attack this country.
So Ukraine clearly wants NATO membership, but it also needs weapons. NATO member states have promised more air defense systems for Ukraine. Is that the main thing that Ukraine wants right now in terms of weapons?
Sure, that is the most pressing kind of part of the Ukrainian wish list. You've seen those images yesterday, that even Kyiv, even the capital with the most dense network of air defenses, is still so vulnerable and you're still so unable to really prevent those Russian missiles getting through if Russia sends a lot in one go. But again, this is pretty disappointing. All of these pledges that we've heard from Washington, these are all things we knew about before. These are things that have been trailed in advance. Germany already handing over that Patriot system that was basically re-announced in Washington. So yes, this does significantly improve Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but it is not new and it is not on a scale that would really put an end to this problem. I think the big remaining question mark is whether those Israeli Patriot systems that have been mothballed, 8 of them, we believe, if they were to make their way to Ukraine, that would then add up to what Ukraine currently has and would really allow that map to be closed and most major cities to be protected.
Is President Zelensky concerned that U.S. support for Ukraine, and by extension NATO support, could decline after the U.S. presidential election in November, Nick?
Certainly, there is panic in the city here in Kyiv about a second Trump presidency, not only because we've had his campaign coming up with ideas how they think they can end this war in 24 hours, basically by pushing Ukraine, as Ukraine would see it, to capitulate, to hand over big swathes of territory to Vladimir Putin. But also there's history here. You'll remember Trump's first impeachment was about him and his team trying to push Volodymyr Zelensky to basically create compromising news stories about Hunter Biden, his business dealings in Ukraine, to help Trump in his US political battles. So there is real bad blood there and real fear. I think it's about damage limitation right now, reaching out to more mainstream Republicans, hoping that they will influence Trump and his team to try and kind of pull back on some of those most extreme ideas. But there is huge worry here, and there's a real hope that now some of these measures to try and institutionalize support for Ukraine, put it on a NATO level rather than having it all organized by the US military, things that Trump could row back in a hurry, and the hope basically to try and get as much aid here and to get as many structures in place before a potential Trump presidency.
Nick, thank you so much. That was our correspondent, Nick Connolly, in Kyiv.